St Kilda, 100 miles west of the mainland of Scotland. It's hard to imagine anywhere in the British Isles more grim and unfriendly to man than this group of rock stacks and islands in an Atlantic storm. And yet this gale-swept place was home to a small, hardy community of Gaelic-speaking Scots for possibly 1,000 years. Atlantic grey seals are at home here in the surf that thunders through the caves, perfectly adapted to an environment that provides them with a rich diet of fish. But how did man survive here, cut off from the rest of civilization by this Atlantic weather? The answer was seabirds, millions of them, guillemots, razorbills, puffins, and most of all the fulmars. Until the middle of the 19th century, this was the only nesting place in the whole of Britain for fulmars, here on the grassy ledges of the highest sea cliffs in the United Kingdom. Plenty has been written about St Kilda, but understandably the film record is pretty sparse. The first to take up the challenge was the English naturalist Oliver Pike. As early as 1908, he took the first ever cinefilm of its people and their unique seabird harvest. Oliver Pike's bulky 35mm cine camera captured some of the earliest wildlife movies ever taken in Scotland. He captioned this shot of the fulmar chick spitting defiance at the camera as the staple diet of the St Kildans. He recognized the significance of the seabirds as food, and bird fowling as a key to survival. Watched by his dog from the top of the cliff, the fowler staked his life on his rope and went fishing for birds with rod and line. Fulmars for meat and feathers, guillemots for eggs by the 100 dozen, gathered from their crowded breeding colonies. Puffins, the smallest and tamest of the auk family, were also caught, with a snare dropped over the head from the end of a long pole, or with horsehair nooses laid out in lines on the rock to trap them by their feet. A good catcher could harvest 100 a day that way. Fishing was always hazardous, and they seldom ventured far from the shelter of Village Bay. Oliver Pike witnessed a highly successful catch landed at the concrete pier below the village, which must have called for a combined effort by the whole community. Accompanied as usual by hordes of dogs, the fishermen and their children hurry past the factor's store at the head of the pier on their way to help with the communal job of gutting and salting the catch down on the rocks. This too was a scene a little later for skinning and butchering several sheep, with the children lending a hand and the ever-present dogs looking for a share in the spoils. The women's workload must have been non-stop, but their living conditions were vastly improved by the cement-rendered Button Ben cottages built in 1860 by their laird, the MacLeod of Skye. Traditionally, the women did most of the croft work, whereas the men were as skilled as weavers and tailors as they were as cragsmen. What was Oliver Pike's secret in securing such unself-conscious shots of children and of this whole family helping the washerwoman down by the well? In fact, they had seen a camera before. 18 years earlier, in 1890, the schoolmaster and his pupils and many of the other islanders had been photographed by George Washington Wilson. He found the St Kildans excellent subjects for his wonderful portraits, but he also took scenes like this view of the graveyard. One result of his photographs was publicity, which rapidly opened up the island to tourism with regular steamer trips from Glasgow. By the time Oliver Pike arrived in 1908, it seems that the men were practiced at demonstrating how they landed on the bird rock from a boat. But one suspects that this light-hearted performance took place somewhere in the safety of Village Bay. The real thing was often over-dramatized, but the method of landing on Stack Lee really was by throwing a rope over a hook at the base. And this, believe it or not, was the actual landing place. The ruin of the Factor's store was the result of a visit by a German U-boat in May 1918. Too late, a naval gun was supplied but never fired. After the war, a Pathé news story again shows cliff climbing. But don't we recognize some of Oliver Pike's original footage and the same Fowler as before as he makes his precarious way down for Guillemet's eggs? By the 1920s, the eggs were collected mostly to sell to tourists. But far from helping the island economy, the cash enabled them to buy tinned food, and so removed their primary incentive to go to the cliffs for their harvest of eggs or birds. Fowling had been a way of life, so that every St Kilda boy had had the ambition to be a good cragsman. But now the incentive was gone, and the result was a steady decline in the traditional skills. By the 1920s, there were frequent crises when urgent messages for help had to be sent by a floating container tied to an inflated sheep's bladder. This was the famous St Kilda Mail, of which this may be the only authentic surviving picture. In 1923, for example, following a wet, stormy winter and the failure of the potato crop, the islanders were only saved from starvation by a chance visiting trawler which brought back word of the crisis. Help was therefore sent on the 20th of May 1923 by the SS Hebrides, the first tourist boat since the previous summer. And this whole episode was turned into a news-type silent film by Robello and Mann of Glasgow, who were among those on board at Glasgow docks as she left. By 1923, St Kilda was news. Tourist boats had been calling since 1830, but by the 1920s the craze was really over and the damage had been done. The islanders besieged the steamer on arrival, anxious for supplies and a chance to sell their goods to the visitors, whom they rowed ashore along with the vital supplies they had brought. The island population was aging but still viable. The men seem unperturbed by the camera. The women were different, and now that we know this caption is not true, we can see a dramatic change in their attitude to the camera. But is it just that they don't want to be peered at as Britain's most primitive community, or were they refusing to show their faces unless they were paid? Certainly, all the evidence is that they were only too ready to receive any handouts that were going. One wonders whether Robello and Mann, like many others, realized that here was a community starting to disintegrate, no longer able to look after itself, with young people leaving or sometimes whole families, and those that were left preserving their old skills more as a demonstration for tourists than for their own subsistence. But they were often exploited, and life was too hard ever to make enough money for the needs of the older folk, and as so often, the women bore the brunt of the work. Mrs. MacDonald looks thoroughly put out by the unwanted attention of the cameraman, but one wonders whether soft words or a good enough fee were needed to work this wondrous change of mood. On the first steamer day of the year, there's knitwear for sale. Visitors also brought hundreds of letters to receive the coveted St Kilda postmark. Whole sequences were now being actually directed by the cameraman. Perhaps the most important visitors this time were the doctor and the nurse on their way round the houses. Inevitably, the visitors and the camera crew want to see and record bird fowling. But though the cliffs and the danger are real enough, the demonstration is more of a performance for the camera, and no longer anything to do with reaping a natural harvest and laying in vital supplies for the winter. Yet the old skills are there, and the Fulmer harvest did in fact go on quite successfully in some years after 1923, though fewer and fewer able-bodied men took part. This time the caption probably is true, as it's doubtful if Oliver Pike's film was ever seen by the islanders themselves, though it caused a sensation in London. Some islanders seem shy or else very reluctant to go to the show, and one wonders what the Glasgow film men showed on the screen. Or what the minister thought of using the kirk for the show. Robello and Mann also took a rare picture of the narrow strips of cultivation below the village street. They were for one of the last potato crops ever grown in St Kilda. Only 7 years after they left, the last ever movie film of the St Kilda people was taken by ornithologist and amateur cameraman John Ritchie. He came to film the evacuation of St Kilda, the island that had failed. Late in August 1930, the Dunara Castle came to take off the islanders' animals and other possessions prior to their own evacuation by the Admiralty on HMS Harebell on August the 29th. As ever, the islanders came out to greet the steamer from the pier and to help ferry more tourists ashore. But this time, everything else was different. Already over 600 sheep had been taken out on an earlier boat. The rest were penned inside the dike beside the kirk. The work of loading them and ferrying them out to the Dunara Castle went on well into the evening, but in spite of the poor light, John Ritchie seems to have realized that he was recording a dramatic occasion, the end of an era. A motor launch had been loaded at Lochmaddy and was used to tow out the islanders' rowing boats to save time. 573 sheep were loaded in this way, but the launch was not big enough to take the cattle, 13 of which were swum out to the steamer the next day and lifted on board with slings. The busiest place those last 2 days was the post office, with Neil Ferguson, the postmaster, stamping thousands of letters with the last St Kilda postmarks. At first, John Ritchie was able to film the islanders without difficulty, showing people carrying their pathetic bundles of belongings. It cost him, however. This lady charged him £2 to take this shot. Then comes a change. Everyone starts to hide. Perhaps the islanders' patience was exhausted, their anxiety mounting to breaking point. For suddenly all the women and girls are trying to escape, taking refuge behind closed doors, fed up with being watched, a people at the end of their tether asking only to be left alone to their grief as the final moments approach. One has to sympathize. She only wants a drink from the well, but the camera stands between her and her privacy in her own house. It's a sad end to the story, the emotional death throes of a proud people. And so the Dunara Castle left with the news reporters and our cameraman with the final film record of the people for whom St Kilda had been home for 1,000 years. And so, in 1930, St Kilda went back to nature, except perhaps for the occasional trawler sheltering in Village Bay. One attraction to such fishermen was a chance to help themselves to a sowie sheep. A few of these had been brought across to the main island of Herta at the Evacuation, relics of the original domestic sheep of Britain, now replaced everywhere else by better breeds. In St Kilda's empty years, the sowie flock grew rapidly to form the only flock of wild sheep in Britain, totally unshepherded and left to find their own level of population. The sowies thrived, and so did the little St Kilda wren, nesting largely in ruined cleats and houses. For several years, some islanders returned to their houses every summer, encouraged by the new owner, the future Marquis of Bute, a keen naturalist. But from 1939 on, the village rapidly disintegrated, and in 20 short years had become both a ruin and an irreplaceable record of a vanished way of life. The houses were a historical record of living conditions, from the latest cottages of 1860 to the earlier black houses of 1830 with their tiny windows and low doors, back to the medieval village further up the hill with its beehive dwellings and cleats. All were weathering badly. Even more primitive and mysterious were the ruins in Glen Bay on the northwest coast of Herta, so-called horn dwellings from the encircling walls of their little courtyards, and the Amazon's house, home of the mythical female warrior of St Kilda, and in 1957 still with a complete, if crumbling, domed roof. Best preserved were the most recent buildings of all, the kirk and schoolhouse down by the pier, whose slated roofs had stood up better to the gales than the tarred felt roofs of Main Street, all rotted away like the cement rendering on the walls, the pattern of neglect. Suddenly, in 1957, the pattern of progress, Operation Hard Rock. On the sandy beach of Village Bay, tank landing craft disgorged trailer loads of building materials in a £500,000 venture to establish a radar station for the South Uist rocket range and to build the first ever road to the top of Mullock Scar and Conacher. The army had planned to use the stones from the old village houses as bottoming for the road, but that scheme mercifully was dropped. Instead, the road metal was quarried from halfway up the hill. The island now had a new owner, the National Trust for Scotland, who arrived just in time to save the day. In 1956, the previous owner, the Marquis of Bute, had died and bequeathed the whole island group to the National Trust for Scotland. In July 1957, the first inspection party from the Trust went to St Kilda just as the army was starting work. The party was led by the chairman of the Trust, Lord Weems. Boats were lowered with some difficulty, and with the Trust's flag flying on St Kilda for the first time, Trust Director Jamie Stormont-Darling, Lord Polwarth, and scientific experts James Fisher and Kenneth Williamson went ashore to assess what was to be done. They found a changed island. There were many decisions to be made, both by the Trust and by the Airfield Construction Branch of the RAF, whose job was to establish the tented camp for about 300 men below the village and to construct the road and radar buildings. Already the army had agreed to re-roof and repair the kirk as the camp church and cinema, and the manse as a sergeant's mess. The village was another matter. What was to be done to prevent further decay and the loss of a unique heritage of building and island culture? The shape of the village street had survived remarkably well, but the graveyard wall was a typical example of work that cried out to be done. Meanwhile, there was, for the first time in 27 years, a new population on St Kilda, with many facilities like hot water and electric light that the indigenous islanders had never known. Totally strange to island life, most of the RAF personnel adapted quickly to the tough conditions, and many found a new interest in living close to nature for the first time in their lives. A young shag rescued on the beach got special treatment and special food. The St Kilda field mice were not quite so favoured when the quartermaster found they were especially partial to army bootlaces and Cadbury's chocolate in the stores. The weather in the appalling summer of 1957 was a real problem both to the road builders and to Chris Milne, faced with making this film for the National Trust of what they'd taken on at St Kilda. But at least he was able to record new life on Herta. 34 years after Robello and Mann's classic documentary of life in 1923, once again there was a queue for the pictures in the Kirk, but this time for seasoned cinemagoers anxious to forget the weather. It's sad to think that many of these young islanders with little resistance to infection had later died on the mainland. Meanwhile, due largely to the commanding officer's drive and leadership, the road and radar buildings were completed, often in appalling conditions of wind, rain and Atlantic mist. The architecture of the technological era had reached the island of 1,000 cleats. Preserving buildings was not the Trust's only problem. Access for the public was the hardest task, solved in part at least by running summer cruises for those who could afford them. Those who were lucky enough to land could see the work that had been done by Trust working parties cementing the ruined houses against further decay. Cruising with the National Trust for Scotland to remote places became something of a cult, based partly on personalities like Lord Wemyss as leaders. But one day in 1971, he was waiting at the pier in St Kilda for a very different kind of cruise ship and visitor, the Royal Yacht Britannia, bringing the whole royal family on the first ever visit by a reigning monarch to Britain's remotest inhabited island. This was a rare opportunity for the royal family to come ashore in relative privacy. The Queen and the Duke of Edinburgh were welcomed by Lord Wemyss for the National Trust and by the officer commanding for the army contingent. The only cine camera present was that of John Wilkie, one of the leaders of the Trust working party at the time, who followed the tradition of Oliver Pike, Robello and Mann and John Ritchie, the unobtrusive camera recording events whose significance speaks for itself. This time it's only the Sowy sheep which run away. The inhabitants are only too keen on this occasion to show off their houses. These three 1860 houses had been re-roofed by the Trust as accommodation for future parties of volunteers. One house will become a museum for the many artifacts that have been found in the ruins, something that Princess Anne found particularly fascinating. Dr. Morton Boyd, director of the Nature Conservancy Council in Scotland, was also there to explain its role in running the island as a national nature reserve. And the warden was able to show the young princes a snipe's nest in the grass behind the village street. For all who were lucky enough to be there, it was a day to remember, a day of rare informality and relaxation for the royal family. A day of recognition for the Trust working parties, most of whose work goes otherwise unseen. It was a milestone in the St Kilda story. In the first 50 years after the 1930 evacuation, St Kilda has taken on a new life and a new strategic importance. More money has been spent here on defence than the islanders could ever have dreamed of. The army camp, now far more compact with its permanent buildings, fits unobtrusively behind the improved and extended pier at one end of the old village street. Herta is now crowned with radar installations largely designed for the safety of shipping in the zone into which missiles are fired from the South US rocket range. Its height and position are ideal for the purpose. The restored Factor's House is used by the Nature Conservancy Council for its resident warden and visiting scientists in their research work, especially on the fascinating biology and population of the Soay sheep. Ear tags on the lambs and leg rings on many birds like the puffins are markers of the extensive use of St Kilda as a kind of wilderness laboratory. The National Trust for Scotland provides a conservation effort. Every year, several work parties of a dozen volunteers under experienced leaders help in the work of restoring the buildings, a privilege they gladly pay for. Most then join the St Kilda Club, open only to those who have spent a night on the island. They come usually quite untrained, but find it a rewarding, even inspiring experience. Perhaps that's why their crowning achievement has been the restoration of the kirk. Not only the building, but the precentor's desk, the pulpit, and all 14 pews have been either rebuilt from the originals or reproduced as faithful replicas. Even the windows are exact copies of what little remained in 1957. And alongside the kirk, the schoolroom has also been restored down to the last moulding on the fireplace, exactly as the children in this 1927 school photograph would have remembered it. And this is how a group of former St Kildans found it when, on the 50th anniversary of the evacuation, they returned from many far-flung places for the rededication of the kirk at a service held at the end of August 1980.
The most important building on Hirscher, the House of God. This particular spot where we find ourselves gathered today is sacred to the memory of many. It was here that they received their early education and religious training, and since have gone forth to other parts of the empire, and for that matter, other parts of the world, and have made a mark for themselves in their new homes.
The sermon was preached by the Reverend Donald John Gillis of Canada. National Trust staff, St Kilda Club members, newsmen and BBC camera crew were there with 7 former inhabitants of the village, which their families had left 50 years before to the day. There was much revisiting of childhood haunts and much nostalgia for the peace and quiet of their island home. In the summer scene, it was easy to remember the good times and to forget the realities of poverty, isolation, endless toil, and that relentless Atlantic weather which has impressed so many passengers on trust cruises round the islands. St Kilda, with its million seabirds, remains one of the finest unspoiled natural sites in all Europe. Since 1957, the influence of the National Trust for Scotland has been crucial in finding ways of letting the public gain access to its most inaccessible property, in preserving, in partnership with the Nature Conservancy, its unique wildlife and natural features, and above all, in ensuring a future for one of Scotland's greatest natural assets.